things I was not accustomed to. That congregation, this is even before the era of a common lectionary, but that congregation had a lectionary, and that meant that instead of me preaching on my favorite topics all summer long, I actually had to take assignments on scriptures that were assigned for particular Sundays. That was a bit scary. It was like having a final exam every week. And for reasons that I don't completely understand, the lectionary text that summer in early August, though there is a reason why that would make sense, included this story of the Transfiguration. And when early in the summer I was doing advanced preparation, I came to this text, I read it and thought, what do I do with hard-headed Connecticut Yankees with this story? It is, after all, a miracle story. Now, what am I going to do? Am I going to try to explain the miracle? What's the task? My other job that summer was to work with Roland Bainton, a name that I remember with great love, one of the foremost church historians of his generation in this country, and a man who was so decent and kind and good that I came to love him. He was working that summer on a book on monasticism, so he was very interested in what could be found in the Sterling Library downtown, the main library of the university, what could be found on the Coptic community and its history in the 3rd and 4th centuries when it gave birth to monasticism. So I was assigned or given a young Coptic scholar. He was the one who could read the texts, and we went down and spent hours, days, and weeks looking at photographic copies of manuscripts from, in this case, the 6th century in a monastery which I later came to know rather well. But we were reading primarily documents from 6th century monks. We went down, and at one point we found copies of a commentary, a biblical commentary on the Gospel of Mark. And in my desperation about this story, I said to the graduate student, could you look quickly and see if there's a commentary on the 9th chapter of the Gospel of Mark? He looked and said, yes, there is. And I said to him, I'll do anything you ask me to do if you'll do me one big favor. Go home tonight. You can take this manuscript with you and translate it for me. I've got to know what he said about this story. My friend agreed that he would do that, and sure enough, if not the next day, a couple of days later, I sat down to read the words of a 6th century monk on the 9th chapter of the Gospel of Mark. Now, I don't know whether that gives you goosebumps. It gave me goosebumps at the time, and it still does even to talk about it. But more surprising was what I discovered that the monk wrote. If I were to put it in conversational form, if I were talking to that 6th century monk, it would have gone something like this. Now, this is a miracle story. How do you understand this miracle story? And I would have come to understand rather quickly that he and I saw very, very different miracles. Mine was that Jesus was transfigured, and that had an impact on all those who were with him. But from the monk's point of view, that wasn't a miracle at all. It speaks, after all, about Jesus. And to the Coptic monk, it was taken for granted that Jesus was indeed the infleshed, incarnate God among us. So Jesus always had shone with an incredible light. From the cradle, from the manger onwards. The problem is that nobody could see Jesus as he really was, so nobody could see the light of God that permeated him fully. The miracle was that 3 sleepy friends of Jesus who were scared to death saw Jesus as he really was for the first time. And that transformed them. They were never, ever to be the same again. In fact, I remember that the monk commented, as they went down from the mountain, it was clear that they would never see anything again in the same way. Now, maybe you see why I find that the starting point for our conversation. And when we get to the point that we're going to look at a bunch of icons, one of the icons that you will see, it happens to be my favorite of all the icons, is the icon of the Transfiguration. And I'm interested because I have a Greek version of that. I have a Coptic version, which is really very amazing. I have a Byzantine copy. You wouldn't have to look very long before you'd know that this is my favorite story. Now, what role do icons play? I think the first thing I need to say to you is that Orthodoxy, as lived and practiced by communities here and everywhere in the world, is a very sensory experience. Does it really matter to Presbyterians what the structure, what the architectural plan is for the place where they worship? Well, I'm sure we're all glad to have Fourth Church because it's beautiful, and we value that, but we wouldn't require that. And we could go and worship in a lot of Presbyterian churches whose architecture I would describe as neo-garage. But not so with the Orthodox. Now, some of them have had in this country to buy Protestant churches. It was all that they could do. So they're stuck with whatever the architecture was, although they try to transform that. But if you go into an Orthodox church, I'll do it very quickly. First of all, you and I are standing under a dome. Now, there may be one huge central dome, or there may be a somewhat smaller dome surrounded by 4 other smaller domes. So the dome can take a variety of shapes, but we are under a dome. And that's very important. Why? Because it means that you and I are standing in the midst of the cosmos. That dome represents the whole of reality, everything. It's not even limited to this world. It includes all the stars and everything that's out there that we know about and some things we don't know about. We stand in the midst of the cosmos. And we stand as a community of priests, that's one way to talk about us, because what we are doing is lifting everything around us up to be confirmed and blessed by God. And therefore, we see these things also transformed by God. Everywhere you look in an Orthodox church, if it's been around a while, you will see icons. For example, when we stand in the center of the church with the dome over us, ahead of us, Orthodox churches, classical ones, are in 3 parts. When you enter, there is a formal entryway. From there, you go into what you and I would call the sanctuary, not what they would call it. And from there, we pass through doors into yet another room, and that's the room where the mysteries are celebrated. What separates, although that wasn't its original intention, what separates the very front part of the church from where you and I stand is something called an iconostasis. It's an icon screen. It has more and more risen all the way to the ceiling, though that's not what was intended. And on the rows of the icons that are there, some icons are designated. They have to be there. Christ and his mother are in designated places. The original apostles are in designated places. Above them may be Old Testament figures, and above them the saints of this particular Russian church. But we are, in effect, looking at pictures in the front, and the sides, the walls would be covered as well, either by something that appears to be sort of like a mural, or by wooden icons. It takes a variety of shapes and forms, but there is nowhere that you can look in the church that the icons are not present. Now, what does that mean? Well, among other things, it means you can never be alone in an Orthodox church. It's not possible, because from the moment you enter the door, you are surrounded by all the saints. And one of the things that may be hardest for you and me to grasp about icons is that icons make present what they symbolize. I think I have to stop there to say something more. Because of our history and our tradition, you and I tend to think about things that are physical and things that are spiritual. And the two are quite different. The Orthodox mind is not shaped that way. Because God became incarnate in Jesus Christ, the answer to the question in the Orthodox community, can you paint a picture of God, is yes. Of course you can. Because that incarnation is Jesus, and because God came in this person of Jesus, who was material, as you and I are material, he was an embodied spirit, as you and I are. One of the effects of that is that it lifted all matter so that everything material can be God-bearing. I know that that doesn't make sense, or if it does, you've made the transition remarkably quickly. But it's one of the reasons why Orthodox people kiss everything. So if I go into a church, and it's maybe before the service, these things I'm doing just to give you clues. I probably would go to the saint for whom I have been named. And I will say a prayer in front of the saint for whom I am named and kiss that saint and acknowledge the fact that that person is a very real presence in my life and hears and accompanies my prayers with his or her own prayers. It's like having a godmother, but even more so. Then I would go around and kiss a number of other icons that have special meaning to me and perhaps to this community, and then the liturgy begins. Now those icons are involved in the worship itself. They are carried in processions. How can I say it? They are treated as if they are real persons because they are real persons. And so the things that happen to us have happened to them and continue to happen to them as we gather in their midst to be the church. Can I tell you a place where I've always felt this most dramatically illustrated? As a pastor, one of the things that I loved to do, and still love to do, is celebrating in the community with the people who are my people, celebrating the sacraments. But the sacraments are about material things. They're about water, they're about bread, they're about wine, and they're about a whole lot of other things, oil in some cases. And it used to be a problem for me because I knew pretty well that the people in the congregation, whom I loved, could not really imagine that Jesus was present in bread, or that wine was holy, or that water needed to be blessed. Because you and I objectify those things. They're the objects in our world, but what really we care about objects. Objects do all kinds of things in our lives. It's not that they're bad, but they are not holy, and they are not transcendent, and they are not grace-bearing. That's the most important thing. They are not grace-bearing. Am I being fair to our congregations? It was unusual for me in a hospital to have someone say, "Would you anoint me with oil?" It's just not part of our reality. But for an Orthodox person, they wouldn't even ask. It would be assumed that when the priest or the friend who has come as a minister of the gospel, when they come, the first thing they will do is to anoint a person because it's a sign of blessing. And the oil really matters. So think about that, because it's, yes, Lucy. Yes. 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 Yeah. Good, Lucy. Thank you. Somebody tell me when we need to stop.
It's 9:30 right now, and I think maybe 10 is that what you think, Alan? 10, make sure you can.
Okay. Maybe this is already enough for you to chew on. What you now know is that the result of God's coming in Jesus Christ for the Orthodox community is that all matter is made holy, and that we are all passing through a process of transfiguration. To be saved, to use the language I learned as a child, is to be transfigured. And transfigured means being deeply involved in the community, the Christian community, and by prayer and a number of other things that we have been given, living one's life in the presence of God, and by the grace of God, being transformed. I could say lots more about that, but that's already, maybe we better look at some of these pictures. Okay. All right. What is an icon? Well, it's a holy image. It can be made with mosaic. It can be painted on wood. It can be put on a plaster wall. This, if you can see it, this is an iconostasis. This is a famous one in a monastery in Moscow. Just to give you a notion.
Do you care if we just come up? If people feel comfortable, we just come up and look?
Sure.
I mean, if you all want to, just get up, and if you don't feel comfortable, we'll probably street it.
What is the, have they made it on wood?
Yes. In the case of an iconostasis, they take a wood, and the first part of the process, it's a very long process. It's treating the wood. When the wood has been properly treated, then something called gesso, which is like a plaster, is put on the surface of that. After that, a layer of mold. After that, the painting of the image itself. So doing an icon requires enormous skill. You have to apprentice to do that, and involves a long period of time. And it can be anywhere from that size to, as you can imagine, these are huge in that church intercourse. It covers an entire front of the church. So there's one of them. If I stop, and I can do that, but I would.
People aren't coming out.
Yeah, and it would take too much time. But you can see how involved you get in icons. So, all right, I'll show you the Transfiguration next. I forgot what number it is. Yeah, so there's my favorite one.
Well, maybe that could be one different. Because that's one shot. You can get that nice and big, I think, with the camera.
Now, icons are always found in churches. You couldn't have an Orthodox community without icons. But icons are also in homes, and especially in the Soviet Union. Just to put a story behind that, I always knew when I went into someone's home whether or not they were faithful members of the church. Remember, this is the Soviet Union. Religion is not sponsored by the government, to say the least. But no matter how small the apartment was, in the eastern corner, there would be candles and icons. That is called the beautiful corner. You know that red square, red square didn't really to Russians mean red square, it meant beautiful square. The word for red and beautiful are the same in Russian. In any case, that was the holy corner. And that's where the family, on any kind of special occasion, would light candles and say prayers and sing hymns. Sometimes that meant that before every evening meal, that would happen. That has a special place in Russian culture, but needless to say, it was found, when I saw that in a home, I knew I was in the presence of Christians who in some way or other were risking their lives for their faith. And that made me respect them and their faith all the more. Yes.
Also, those who paint the icons pray before.
Oh, yes.
Pray before they actually.
I was in the Soviet Union, it still was, in 1988, when the whole world came to Moscow and celebrated the 1000th anniversary of the Russian Orthodox Church. And one of the great moments of celebration was the making a saint of Andrei Rublev. If we had time, some of my icons you would have seen. He's the one who painted the most famous of all the icons. That's the icon of the Trinity. Anyway, he was made a saint because of his work as an iconographer. So you're quite right, not anybody could do this. It requires all kinds of skills on the one hand and disciplines on the other. This is Rublev's icon of the Trinity. I'll just say a word about this. I'm getting worried about the clock. The Trinity is obviously the central reality in Orthodoxy. They're very serious about being Trinitarian. So this icon of the Trinity had existed for centuries, but it is called the Old Testament Trinity because it uses the story of the visit to Abraham of the three angels, hence those three angels. And in all of the previous icons, people are out here on the sides doing all kinds of things, preparing meals, bathing children, and so on. What he did was to cut all of that off, to put these figures in a perfect circle, and hence created the image which every Orthodox person knows. Now, these icons, as you look at them, I'm sorry we couldn't do more of that, maybe next week. But when you look at icons, one of the things that you'll discover is that they're funny looking. They don't paint people and events and reality the way they appear to us and the way they have appeared to artists in the West for centuries. But that's because the iconographer has done a very interesting thing. Many interesting things, but I'll just mention one. You and I look, and in natural painting, we see in perspective. That means that there is a vanishing point somewhere over there. And if we're trying to reproduce that, we make lines from the vanishing point, and when we paint or draw, that indicates depth, right? The Byzantine iconographer has taken the vanishing point and located it behind my head. And that means that perspective is reversed. You see something of that in the way chairs and tables are drawn here, and also figures. Now, if you think about it, that's one of the technical ways that Orthodoxy says our eyes have to be transfigured. And that means we not only see God, we not only see Christ in a very different way than people who haven't had this experience. Where's the sentence going? It means that through iconography, my eyes are helped to see things in a way that I've never seen them before. It's again my monk in Egypt, and as they were going down the hill, they were never to see anything in the same way again. We need to quit now. I'm sorry, because I wanted you to see all these icons.
We can look at a couple more, like it's 22, we have maybe 10 minutes.
Let me turn to you, because it may not seem like it, but I think I have given you quite a lot to sort of contemplate. Do you have questions at this point? Did some of this not make any sense? Yeah.
So I think what you're saying is that the material world is a spiritual world. And I'm thinking, we're all made up of atoms,
Yeah.
if you think about it.
Yes.
Which are the basis of the universe.
Yes.
And that represents this kind of a spiritual orientation of that everything is made from God. or
You're
something like
in
that.
the right road, and you're far down that road. In Orthodoxy, you don't normally use terms like spiritual and physical, because everything is, just as you said, made up of molecules, and every molecule of reality is capable of transformation. It already is God-bearing. So, life is sustained by eating. And we can give all kinds of illustrations about the way in which this goes on in our normal lives. But not only are they God-bearing, they are possible of being transformed. So, for example, what does it mean to talk about the kingdom of God in Orthodoxy? It's not talking about some other place. It's not talking about some other time. It's talking about your body, my body, the food you eat, the food I eat, the whole material world without which we couldn't exist, just as we have hope of being transformed. So when we pray for the kingdom, it literally means we pray that everything around us will be so blessed by God, and that we as people who bear the image of God, we are icons, that we who bear the image of God live in the world in such a creative way as to help with that transformation of everything. Now think about that in relation to issues of preserving creation. I mean, one of the things that has surprised me is that this theology is so old, and yet it is really radical, more radical than we've been able to grasp, because it means that you and I are here, among other things, by grace to be transformed, not forced, but by the exercise of our free will, giving God the permission to be in us by grace and to transform us, and not just us, but the whole world around us. This is why it's interesting to me that in Orthodoxy, people's relationship with animals have always fascinated me. And I think it's because they love animals. Animals are one of the best ways of being able to experience what love and grace and transformation may be all about. Yes?
I'm interested in this kissing.
Yes.
Or kissing the eye.
Yes.
Now, what is that actually, forgive me, what does it actually mean? I know what a kiss is,
Yeah.
et cetera. But what is it a symbol of love?
Yes. It is above all
It's a
that.
symbol of love, okay.
The patron saint that was given to me is Saint Boris. Simple because my name is Bruce, and there is no Bruce in Russian. Boris is about as close as you can get. So if I use that same illustration, Boris has now been present in my life for a long time. And when I go into an Orthodox church and see him, these are real friends. I mean, have you ever, I know you have you ever picked up a picture, especially when you're grieving, of someone that you really love, and you hug the picture, and you kiss the picture, and you feel deep, deep things that have to do with love? That's the relationship with the icon. It means that, first of all, it means that person is really present. It's not just a picture. I'm not guilty of idolatry of the icon, the icon is not an idol, it's an image. And as such, it is real. It's a real person made present to me by the icon, and I can therefore act as if you are there. And if I love you, a kiss of peace in the liturgy is a good example.
So,
I just
yeah,
gotta-
go ahead.
I mean, nowadays people think of icon as something you click on rather than.
Right.
I was just wondering, no, I'm serious, if there's any, people feel like the term has been sort of co-opted by.
I'm sorry, say it again.
Whether the term has been co-opted by the computer age, or people understand that there's another meaning of icon, I'm not sure.
That's interesting.
Modern hijacking.
Yeah.
Yes.
I noticed in that iconostasis you showed that Mary was at the top.
Yes.
And when I've been to Orthodox churches, it seems they place almost as much importance on Mary as the Catholics do on Mary. Sometimes
Yeah.
I go to a Catholic church and I think they're really praying Mary instead of Jesus. So
Yeah.
can you comment on the role of Mary?
Her role is very different in the Western tradition and in the Eastern tradition. I could do a whole lecture on that, and I think it's a fascinating subject. Mary in the Latin tradition is always made Queen of Heaven, and we have come perilously close, even in one recent papacy, to proclaiming her divine. So the Western tradition divinizes Mary and therefore requires the kind of piety that views her as God. In the Eastern tradition, the main importance of Mary is that she's just like us. She's a human being. And so any attempt to deify her would result in abolishing her significance. Her significance is very simple. She's the mother of Jesus. And therefore, she above all is close to Jesus and joins in our prayers and prays for us. But in the same fashion as Boris prays for me, I assume. Does that help? So in one case, Mary's on her way to heaven and becoming God, and in the other, she's kept firmly on the ground because it's important that she remains the first transfigured human being.
I just have a quick question on the planning. You had put in the original word that we were hoping. We're hoping to get a trip to see some churches, because this is great to talk about it, but wouldn't it be great to actually see some? So I don't know, do you have a specific date in mind?
Okay, I simply forgot to say that if you all would like to do it, and if we can find, let's say, a Saturday morning or a time when we could all go together, most of the priests in Orthodox communities here I knew very well 20 years ago. Now everything has changed, but I would be glad to get in with them. And I think what I had in mind was to take a beautiful Byzantine Ukrainian church so that you could see it all outside. And I think I'd take you to the Russian Cathedral, which is on North Levitt Street, and you could see a Russian version. In the back of my head was an idea and get the two priests together to see, in light of the tragedy, whether or not they speak easily to each other. That I don't know about, but we can get into their churches and see it all. And you wouldn't notice great differences. The spring is the same, the root.
Is there a bad Saturday in September that would not work, or is there a particularly good Saturday? I'm available all Saturdays because I knew this was happening, so I kept all my Saturdays free for September. Is there any? We'll get back to you via email as we get a date.
Okay.
Does that seem a reasonable plan?
We'd love to do that if you would like to go.
This was a great gathering, and we had 16 people in this class. If you know people that are interested in this topic, for heaven's sakes, let's get them in here, and then they may want to go on the tour as well. So this is a good time.
All right, thank you so much for coming. And once again, I'm delighted to have had this opportunity.